Welcome to the Responsible Bytes podcast, everyone, the podcast where we talk about all things safe and responsible technology. I'm your host, Dr Zena Assaad, and today I'm joined by Dr Yasmin Afina, who is a researcher at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and her research is at the intersection of AI, international security policy, and international law. Welcome to the podcast, Yasmin.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you today?
Good.
You've been very, very busy this year. I've seen you all over LinkedIn and social media, and something that has been taking up a lot of your time is RAISE, which is the Roundtable for AI Security and Ethics. Can you explain to everyone what the purpose of RAISE is and how it came to be?
Sure. No, thank you for having me here. I think it's I've been following your podcast for quite a bit, so it's really nice to be here. Um, as you
It's so
said,
nice to finally have you on the podcast.
I know, no, I'm really happy. So RAISE, or the Roundtable for AI Security and Ethics, is this project that we've launched at Meteor in March last year in 2024, with the idea of providing a platform for independent, trusted, and neutral dialogue on AI and security. There is the and this essentially the idea is that we've seen that states are starting to take some initiatives when it comes to the governance of AI in the military and security domains, but there is also a need for continued dialogue at the multi-stakeholder level, particularly as we see the value of having that sort of sub-state level discussions, um, including at levels that otherwise it would be too political and it would be too sensitive, too difficult, and it would essentially be either difficult or even impossible to have this kind of conversation. So really, it's about filling in a gap that is that is present within the international community, and we really tried to sort of convene this group of experts to generate some insights, have a dialogue, and really promote this mutual understanding between each members of the multi-stakeholder community. So we've been very fortunate to be supported by Microsoft in this sense. And yeah, we're very proud to say that from the first roundtable up until now, we have members from the whole spectrum of the multi-stakeholder community. So we have government representatives, international organizations, the humanitarian sector, academia, industries, and we have nationals of all P5. So I think that this is super encouraging. Everyone is very active, and also we have representatives from the global majority. So we have supporters and members specifically from Ecuador, for example, or Namibia and Kenya and India and Pakistan. And it's really encouraging to see this traction that we have for such a platform. And we've seen clearly the value of it, as in we had our first roundtable in March, and then we had a second roundtable just before the second WeAIM Summit in Seoul. And these platforms really helped, not only in terms of getting a bunch of people very passionate about the topic around the table, but at the same time also really try to identify areas of priorities and convergence where there is a lot of room for us to work together. So we've been seeking to use that platform to inform discussions, whether it's at the multilateral level or even at international, regional, or national levels. We've seen evidence of that sort of channel of information that we generate, and we're really trying to continue to maintain this kind of channel for discussions when, especially in an era where unfortunately discussions are not always the easiest thing to achieve. So
As we've both experienced.
and I think that it's really great. Like, and something that is also really key about RAISE is that beyond just convening experts around the table, it's also about building a community and building trust between members of that community. So there is also the social aspect, and the way that we design the convenings is also very much based on ready evidence of psychological aspects, where you have the roundtable discussions, but you also go on pairs wall, you get ice cream together or get a drink, and it's really about having very productive discussions.
You sold me on ice cream, Yasmin. That's it. That's all I needed.
Well, actually, the first roundtable that we had was in Italy, and literally by the entrance of where we're having the conversation, there was a fantastic gelateria, and it was just great. Sometimes I would just tell people, go get gelato and talk about AI and the security, and people were very happy
See,
about
this is going to make me sound really terrible, but I now want to be a part of Raise just so that I can be a part of a meeting in which I get to have frequent breaks throughout the day where I get to go and get
it.
gelato.
I guess it depends because every time like there I always get this feeling of post raise, like it's like a hungover feeling, but specifically after raise because then your brain is so fried because yeah, it might be more relaxed and much more informal, but at the same time because everyone is really trying to work towards something, and everyone is always consistently trying it to sort of have a constructive dialogue. It does get tiring. And it's not really
It
about,
really does. I don't think people realize that when you are a part of these kinds of dialogues, it's tiring for lots of reasons. I think one of the reasons is going over the same point
yeah,
consistently. And then I think the second thing that makes it very tiring is coming to a consensus, which is essentially a compromise of different views and opinions. And that's also really exhausting to get to.
yeah. So I think that the thing about race is that we are, of course, trying to understand where they could become an understanding, but it's also a group where we can respectfully agree to disagree. And I think that it's also being
Mm.
able to understand where is it that the differences are there and very much ingrained, or where is there room for us to work together. And I think that, acknowledging that you can't agree on everything, it's fine. And it might also be that you realize that sometimes it's due to not just the lack of political will, but also the sheer sort of cultural differences or even linguistic differences. Something that we've heard is from our members, for example, is that um, so we have members, of course, who are native English speakers, but we also have non-native English speakers, and in their respective language, you have certain terms and concepts such as autonomy or trust that are defined very differently than in English. And I think just being able to understand that context gets you to a point where, okay, you might not agree on the definition of autonomy where everyone agrees with one another, but at least having this understanding of how your counterpart approaches that can get you a long way rather than, facing a wall and you're like, oh, we can't achieve anything because we can't agree on anything. And I think like sometimes, yeah, it's actually understanding your counterpart. And sometimes in the end, the more you dig, the more you sort of realize there are more commonalities and not, but perhaps it's coming from two different ways. And yeah, it's really about promoting dialogue that enables that mutual understanding.
And so Raise has the word security in its title, but not the word safety. But the description of Raise talks about safety. So can you explain the difference to me between security and safety and why security has been put at the forefront of Raise?
Yeah. So I think that it's good that we actually mentioned this semantics just now because and something that we also realize in our conversations is that in certain languages, security and safety are the same word. So we hear that, for example,
Mm.
in Mandarin, we've heard, I was in Beijing just a month ago, and that was exactly what they were saying. Security and safety are the same word. So how do you differentiate one from the other? So I think the way that we approach race is that we're not separating security from safety, but rather we see them as complementing one another. So for that, we sort of approach AI governance with a series of sort of dimensions, but one key aspect of it is the life cycle dimension of AI. Um, and security and safety can really kick in throughout the life cycle of the technology. As in, it's not because your technology is found to be safe in the English sense before the deployment that it will continue to be safe throughout the life cycle. And even at the development stage, if your technology is not necessarily secure, for example, against adversarial attacks or even natural factors, then it doesn't necessarily mean if it's safe in the development, it doesn't mean it's always, if it's not, sorry, let me get back to that. If it's secure at the development stage, it doesn't mean that it's always secure as well after the use, right? Um, so I think it's more rather than seeing them separately, it's really about two sides of the same coin.
Find it really interesting that you're talking about safety and security being two sides of the same coin. And when you explain how you got there, you're talking about language and the way the ideas of safety and security are interpreted across different languages. I can completely understand where you're coming from. But as someone who is a system safety engineer, from my perspective, I see safety and security as I can agree that they're complementary, but I would argue that they're quite distinctly different things. So have you come up against that in some of the discussions within Raise of some people believing that they are distinctly two things while other people believing that they're far more interlaced?
No, of course. I think that, again, it's one of those things where people do agree to disagree. And of course, we don't really have an opinion. But it's more like, oh, we do observe that for some communities and for some members, safety and security, well, as you said, are complementary. They're also very much sort of inherently different and will require different measures. And I think that's also something to understand, is that even for those that sort of see even linguistically security and safety as the same thing, it does not mean that you should not get to the point where you have appropriate measures to ensure what corresponds to safety and what corresponds to security of the systems. Um, for those who are specifically working on the safety of systems like yourself and members of that community, it's really about a very specific set of assurances, for example. But at the same time, for security as well, you might require a different set of measures, different set of processes, different set of stakeholders that you'll be engaged as well. So I think that even though, yeah, there are differences in the way that things are approached, eventually we all get to the understanding that there are different steps and different processes that need to be taken at various levels to ensure that we achieve whatever we're trying to achieve through that responsible AI umbrella that we see so prevalent today.
So then the second word that comes into Raise is ethics. And so if you had people who were contentious about the word security, I imagine ethics was even more contentious. So can you explain what ethics means in the context of Raise and why it was made a focal point?
Sure. So I think that disclaimer, I'm not an ethicist myself. I'm an international
Neither
lawyer.
am I, but we can still have very strong opinions about it.
Just wanted to make that clear so that the ethicists aren't coming howling at me. But I think that's something
I
that we
feel like I always have to put that caveat in. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not an ethicist. However, here is
that's
my 2 cents.
that's very much my hat. I think that I need to put aside. But I think that something that we are trying to understand within Raise is not just what we could do, but also potentially what we should do. And I think that's where ethics sit in, as in, if you look at, again, coming back to my background as an international lawyer, if you put international on the one hand or ethics on the other, you have international law that gives you whether you could do something, but then ethics tells you what you should be doing. And sometimes it's not because you could that you should. And I think there's also the part where one complements the other. And that's also very much part of international humanitarian law when you're thinking about the principles that underpin it, like the way that you interpret and approach international humanitarian law, for example. Um, so coming back to ethics and race, I think that there's a few things to it. One is that we're really trying to not just understand what the international community could do, but also what it should be doing by setting out actionable recommendations. And I think that having ethics as a sort of compass to frame our discussions and our recommendations is truly something that helps to ground our discussions. But then also when I say grounding our discussions, it just basically means that we're not just running our discussions on existing international law, which I think is important, especially today when there are so many actors that argue that just international law in itself um, is under risk when it comes to actual implementation and respect. But then there's also the whole set of perhaps guiding principles and ethical frameworks that the different actors are also adopting to go beyond the minimum threshold. And we're really trying to encompass those discussions into our collective thinking. The second aspect that I think is important to note as well is that, again, coming back to the issue of differences in linguistics, for example, something that we're also acknowledging as part of RAISE is that ultimately, if you want to have a diverse set, well, you also have to factor in the fact that they have different sets of values and different, they're hailing from different sets of cultures. And it might be that ethics are very much approached differently from one culture to another. And that's absolutely fine. And I think it's also a part where we're trying to understand where everyone can agree, regardless of the cultural differences. But then there's also where is it that we need to level to maintain a certain margin of discretion or level of flexibility to allow for cultural differences to sit in. Because then it's one thing to issue recommendations, it's another thing to issue recommendations that might not speak to a specific culture, for example, that then translates into the way that they approach policy and the way they approach legal frameworks. And yeah, you want something that works for everyone. And of course, perhaps it may sound naive or it might sound very idealistic, but I think that if we don't try to achieve that level, then it is very difficult to sort of steer your efforts and aim high, basically.
So you kind of spoke about the different cultural perspectives around this idea of ethics and ethics in AI. And arguably, we're currently in a time of quite a tumultuous geopolitical climate, really. And so when we think about cultural differences and we think about it in the context of the current geopolitical climate, do you find that that has colored some of the conversations that you've had?
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, you know, it, different geopolitical differences are not just a product of cultural differences, but I think that it reflects very much in the way that certain states are approaching policy questions, and that eventually can translate at the international level. Um, just very anecdotally, and it might be a bit sort of a tangent, but at the same time, I think it was quite an interesting example. Again, as part of the discussions in Beijing that I had last month, something that I found super interesting is that um, you saw this group of experts coming from Rays, really discussing the value of a human-centric approach, a human-centric framework. Um, and come to think of it, the human-centric approach can be seen as individualistic. And we had the opportunity to engage with Beijing-based stakeholders and experts. And some of them actually told us, well, we prefer people-centric approach rather than human-centric approach. And I think that, when you think about the philosophical side of things and the cultural side of things, um, it does resonate a lot with the idea of the collective over the individual that might be sort of prevalent in a way in liberal sort of philosophical context. So, and that sort of then is translated into the way that they're approaching international policy, and hence, my personal guess is that that's why, for example, there is such an insistence coming from China when it comes to capacity building, because there is also the part where the collective should have the capacity in order to be able to harness the opportunities that AI could offer, whether it's when it comes to SDGs, but also international peace and security. And I think that is that was fascinating for me to see and to hear directly from these experts. And hence, it really shows the value of having this kind of dialogue that otherwise you will not be able to have. Like, if you don't have the conversation, how are you supposed to know?
Well, it's interesting to me. It's I guess I'm interested in this idea of the individual versus the collective. What's more interesting to me, which is perhaps actually not that interesting objectively, is the fact that the word human was seen as individual on their side. Because when I think of human-centered approaches, I think of that from a collective perspective. So I'm actually fascinated that for them, the word human was individualistic as opposed to collective.
No, of course, and it's I don't want to generalize and speak for another culture, and it might be that it was just a very specific community of people that we've happened to speak to. But at the same time,
It
yeah,
could also be that language barrier, right? Like
exactly.
maybe when you do translate things to Mandarin or Cantonese, it does translate in that way where human is individualistic as in a single person, and then you need to use a plural sense of the word.
Yeah. But that's why I think it really underscores the value of having conversations with both sides, because then
Hmm.
you're able to better understand where is this policy coming from. And I think that, again, better understanding the underlying and wider complex sort of factors that then trickle down into policy really helps to then build something and see where there is this mutual understanding. you're saying that when you're approaching human-centric approach, when you're defining human-centric approach, you see that as working towards a collective. And it might be that actually just facilitating the dialogue to understand that actually both might mean the same thing, then that would be very much valuable. And that's exactly what Raise is trying to do. It's really trying to build the bridges, build the conversation, and build understanding that otherwise impossible to get.
And so we're talking about kind of ethics and security. We've touched on each of them individually. I kind of want to explore them together. Now, I imagine that when you were establishing Raise, you thought of security and ethics as complementing one another. And I imagine that they do in a lot of ways. But can you describe maybe some of the ways you found them to be in tension with one another, especially when you're having these kinds of discussions? Have you seen some of that tension be drawn out?
Yeah, oh, totally. I think that, of course, you have, and this tension can be very much multidimensional, right? Like, um, some may say that from a national security perspective, ethics is jeopardizing national security because ethics might expect a certain level of transparency that may be at odds with national security and secrecy. Another argument
Interesting.
Another argument that I heard is also the sheer cost of it. How do you implement and operationalize ethics and responsible AI within a within a certain supply chain, and specifically for I've heard that from small and medium enterprises where for them it's like, well, we don't really have the resources for ethical AI, whether it's when it comes to technical solutions, but also the people, just the people, just the human resources to be able to be up to speed in terms of what are the latest international discussions in this space, what is the latest in terms of what states are adopting. But eventually, I think that it is something that, they say, oh, it is extra cost. And what sort of incentives do I have as a small, medium enterprise to adopt ethical AI when at the same time, my clients, i.e. governments, are looking for rapid adoption of AI, especially in the military domain. And we see that, right? Like we see that in the past few months where there is this tendency of um, trying to sort of promote rapid deployment, whether it's because of operational needs or even strategic needs, whether it's because of deterrence, for example. I've heard that very much in the Shangri-La dialogue. And so I think that the way that we're approaching things is that we're trying to sort of see um, ethics and responsibility and security as actually sort of mutually reinforcing one another. Because eventually, if you do have visibility over what are the ethical expectations that your client might have or even society might have, um, then you sort of are able to anticipate some of the needs of your client. So if eventually further down the line governments are adopting um, responsible AI principles as part of their procurement, and in the call for tender it says that they need to demonstrate, the vendor needs to demonstrate a certain level of alignment with responsible AI principles, then being able to anticipate those from the beginning can actually save you cost and time rather than actually having it as an afterthought. So that's something that we're really trying to sort of say is that visibility over and certainty over what is expected of you can really take you a long way. And I think something that is also key as well is that we see this growing sort of desire by certain corporations and industry actors into just not just being a passive support, but actually be active, sort of playing an active role in defining what is responsible AI and what does it mean in practice. Of course, you do hear the sort of reluctance to have these actors at the table, whether it's because of lobbying concerns, whether it's because of ethics washing. And we've seen throughout history why these concerns can be valid. And I think this is also something that needs to be taken into account. But at the same time, dialogue is better than no dialogue. And eventually, again, it might very much depend on the cultures of the industrial ecosystem as well. But if you do make the case of actually the industry actually being able to play an active role in helping to operationalize responsible AI, well, of course, again, reiterating the fact that policymaking remains a sovereign prerogative of states, I think that can really take us a long way, especially when discussions at the policy level might either be facing a grind halt, or there are issues around operationalization and no one really knows what's going on. So I think that, yeah, we've seen across different cultures where the industrial ecosystem might actually see themselves as more passive, and this is where there might be a bit more work to be done in terms of trying to reach out to them and say, look, it doesn't mean that you're interfering with policy making as well, because they don't want to, they don't necessarily want to be seen as interfering with policy making. But at the same time, there is so much to contribute in one way or another. That yeah, this is exactly why I think that we're really trying. This is the framing that we're trying to use in order to justify that security and ethics can understandably raise an tension.
So, to date, ethical AI and responsible AI are not legally mandated. Now, the EU Act kind of covers some bits and pieces, but that's for Europe, obviously. But outside of that, it's really not mandated. So, what is the incentive for states to want to adopt ethical or responsible practices around AI, particularly in a military context?
Mm-hmm. So I think that when it comes to ethics, of course, as you said, it's not legally binding. But when it comes to responsible AI, again, maybe it's my bias as an international lawyer, but we see time and again, whether it's in the outcome documents of the RE80 summit, or whether it is in last year's resolution of the United Nations Summit's First Committee, the resolution 17929 on AI in the military domain, that reaffirms that essentially responsible AI in the military domain entails compliance with international law. And I think we need to sort of see compliance with international law as a key pillar to this umbrella wider term of responsible AI. And eventually, of course, one might say companies and corporations are not bound by international humanitarian law, for example, but in the end, their clients are, states are, and the individuals who might be operating and using and the decision makers around these technologies, they may also be bound by international criminal law, for example. And even that, you might actually have international humanitarian law implications for those that are involved in providing warfighting capabilities. So basically, I think that it is really important to note that even though you might not see responsible AI as legally binding because there's no specific international treaty on responsible AI in the military domain, it does not mean that responsible AI is operating in a vacuum. There are existing international legal instruments that need to be further unpacked. And just to sort of get into that, so for example, I was talking about international humanitarian modifications on those providing warfighting capability. In international humanitarian law, there's this concept of distinction. So you can only target combatants or military objectives, and the rest is basically civilian or civilian objectives. And there is this assumption of everyone civilian until proven otherwise. But civilians lose their protection when they are directly participating in hostilities. What does this directly participating in hostility in modern warfare? What does it mean when, as a citizen, I want to operate a drone that I ordered online, and I want to use that drone to get some footage that I will then send to my armed forces? This is an example where it can be like by providing critical intelligence, I could be seen as directly participating in hostility. Now, coming to AI, what if this providing this data will train an AI system by an armed forces that will then be used for efforts of war? It could also be seen as directly participating in hostility. And it's not just about citizens, it's also about the companies that are providing the solutions, these warfighting solutions in modern conflict. Could companies be considered as directly participating in hostilities? Or how about, for example, if companies are sending engineers to maintain the technologies that are being deployed in the battlefield? Could they be seen as directly participating in hostilities? And eventually, companies will also want to protect their own staff. So I think, or at least I hope so. So I think that there is also the part where really responsible AI is this complex of blob of international legal obligations, but also implications that can happen to you. And you can be targetable by just providing a they will fight it. But it might be stretching a little bit, but it could be interpreted as such. And I think it's really important that we raise awareness on this multidimensional aspect of international law and everyone.
Do you feel like the introduction of AI, particularly in the military domain, challenges some of the existing laws in that area, and that's why we need things like ethical principles or responsible practices? Do you feel like those are bridging mechanisms?
So there are a few school of laws here, but it's like something I've actually implemented the project last year on international humanitarian law and its application in relation to nuclear autonomous weapon systems just last year. My colleagues are working on phase 2 of this project, but essentially while taking stock
I'll just for our listeners, I will provide the link to that in the comments, in the
Great.
description. Sorry.
No, of course. And basically, we took in the phase 1 of the project, we took stock of how states are approaching international humanitarian law in relation to lethal autonomous weapon systems. And I think one key lesson that we see here is that there is a difference, and I think even beyond AI, there is in lethal autonomous weapon systems, there is a difference between the law as it is versus the law as it should be. And I think that we tend to sort of not make the differentiation, but it really does make a difference.
Yeah.
And I think that, we don't really have any specific position as in whether the law as it is sufficient, because it's not really our place to have any position on that matter. But regardless of whether one sees the law as it is as sufficient, I think that looking at what the law entails already based on what exists and what measures can be adopted to implement and operationalize some of these legal principles, I think that's where we need to do more work. I see, for example, a lot of efforts, for example, on responsibility by design and integrating Article 36 legal reviews in the development of AI in the military domain. There's excellent work being done, for example, by Article 36 legal. And I think that
Shout out to Damien Copeland.
Exactly. Hi, Damien, if you listen to this podcast. But I think that, it is also something like beyond Article 36 legal reviews. How can we look, for example, into the obligation to respect and ensure respect? What does it mean in practice? And really being able to unpack some of these measures to better help implement the law as it is already is something that in the context of artificial intelligence, whether it's autonomous weapon systems or not, I think there is so much work to be done. And sometimes it might be that states are actually telling us we don't have the capacity. We don't have capacity to do that. We don't have the human capacity to think about this. We don't have the legal expertise, or we simply don't have the time. So then there comes a question of like how do we build the capacity of these states that further down the line are bound by international law as well, and they want to abide by international law. So I think it's really about, trying to see if there's any way of building the capacity of states and government bodies to better comply with international law when it comes to artificial intelligence. How do we do that? That's another question, especially in an age where, unfortunately, capacity building efforts are not necessarily the efforts that attract the most funding at the moment. But and I speak that coming from the multilateral world, where essentially funding in the international system is very much in crisis. But at uni, we're trying to do what we can. Colleagues are doing excellent work in terms of supporting states and building their position on international law in relation to cyber. And I can clearly see the value of doing that as well in relation to artificial intelligence.
It is definitely a struggle, especially in the current climate, where there are very strong and quite binary debates around the way we move forward with AI, right? Like people are talking about laws and regulations being inhibitors of innovation. I'm not of that school of thought, but some people are. And so I do understand the struggle of trying to get not even just funding, but just getting a group of people in the same room, wanting to talk about the ways in which we could embed regulations and laws and responsible practices in a way that actually supports innovation as opposed to inhibiting it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally. So no, I think that bottom like down the line, I think that one key thing is that responsible responsible innovation can actually drive innovation much faster and better. And it's actually making your innovation much more resilient to the test of time.
Well, I think this leads us very smoothly into our final question, which is the question that I ask all of my guests. And it is, what is one piece of advice that you would have for engaging with technology safely and responsibly? So what is your one responsible byte?
I think that, well, it might be a very important, but it's really about trying to be open-minded and trying to trying to be open to learn and be uncomfortable at times in learning not only other perspectives but also other disciplines. I'm I'm an international lawyer by training, like my bachelor's in law, master's in law, PhD in law. But when I started my PhD in international law, it's on international humanitarian law and seeing how these IHL considerations can inform the development stages of AI for military targeting. When I started my PhD, literally the thing that my supervisors made me do in my first year is to go full exploratory mode and better understand the technology. And the goal is not
What great advice.
I know, it's fantastic. I love my supervisors. And he's a
They
nerd.
were like, you're doing a PhD in international law, so we would like you to start by reading on everything that is not international law.
No, exactly. And I think that,
It's actually brilliant advice.
like, international law, but you don't know the technology. So for you to be able to engage with the legal questions that are out there, you also need to understand what is the technology that that we're talking about. And I think that it was a fantastic advice, and I actually had the luxury of spending a whole year to just be able to understand the technology. And they kept saying time and again, the aim is not for me to become a computer scientist. Like, there's absolutely nothing that's not something that can be done within a year, and that's not the objective of that PhD. But at the same time, it's really, again, being able to understand the basics so that then you can start to unpack the more complex legal questions, grounded in technical evidence, but also grounded in reality around the technology. Because I think something that is very dangerous when it comes to artificial intelligence, but also tech in general, we do tend to sort of get carried away by the hype and really trying to jump to the bandwagon. And I think it's great that everyone wants to talk about AI and the military, but it really needs to be done carefully, especially when it comes to some of the assumptions and misconceptions that we might have on artificial intelligence. And it might be that sometimes there was so many times where during that first exploratory year, I had massive existential crisis because I was like, I don't know what I believe in anymore. And I think that being able to actually understand that, you're actually actively trying to unpack some of your misconceptions and assumptions. And it's not necessarily to tell you need to change everything that you believe in, but it's really adding another layer to your analysis and being able to open to question your own assumptions to then make your own analysis. I
Which
think
is a super hard thing to do.
it's
It's
so
very
hard.
easy to say, I want to be able to question my own assumptions. I want to make sure that I have a thorough understanding, but it is quite a challenging thing to read something that contradicts an assumption that you had. And you have to sit with it for a bit and be like, was I wrong this whole time?
Yeah, and you don't know where to start as well. As in, like, it's one thing for me to,
Yeah.
like, computer science for dummies, but then, like, where do I start? I don't know. And I think, again, coming back to
How
Ray,
far down this rabbit hole am I supposed to go?
exactly. And there were
And
so
then
many times.
talking about language as well, you were talking
Yeah,
about language across different cultures. I also am an interdisciplinary researcher, and language across different disciplines is its own minefield, right? So
yeah.
I obviously work with lawyers like yourself. I work with a lot of social scientists. I work with a lot of political scientists and ethicists. It was a huge learning curve for me, just learning the completely different language and lingo that was used in these disciplines. Like, people would say things and I would write notes of these words to like go and look them up and be like, what does this mean?
No, of course, no. I think that it's just, yeah, and I think that it's not something that you can do in a year, like what I did. Like in a year, the PhD was really useful to get the basics, but it's a continuous learning process, right? And I think
It
that
is.
something that you need to remind yourself oftentimes, um, and I think that that's also the value of Braze is that it provides a platform where within the same room you have access to all different kinds of disciplines, and they might offer you a very fresh and different perspectives on something that you've held for so long, and it either makes you change your mind, which is not necessarily again the goal of race, but at least it adds an extra layer of nuance that helps you to better engage in a more constructive way on some of these issues. So really, my one piece of advice is to really be multidisciplinary, because that is the way. And I think I was really fortunate when coming back to my PhD. I was very fortunate to have very supportive PhD supervisor, but I know I've encountered throughout my legal studies where a lot of international lawyers really want to stick to international law, and they're a bit more reluctant when it comes to multidisciplinary research. And of course, you have to keep a certain focus, because in the end, my PhD is in international law. It's not a computer science PhD, but at the same time, yeah, being able to pick some elements from right and left to make sure that whatever you're building is solid um, is really important. And finding the avenues and platforms to do that is incredibly difficult. And that's why I think, yeah, I might be biased again, but like initiatives such as RAISE are so important to maintain this level of dialogue, but also a lot of self-questioning and added nuances to each of our respective reflections. Because what we're also trying to do is that when it's good for us to meet maybe once a year or twice a year as a group within RAISE, but then what do we take out of the discussions? I want every RAISE member to come back to their respective organizations and countries and cities to have a lot of food for thought, and then report back to their colleagues, and then actually have a conversation around it. And I think that I've heard time and again a few times where RAISE members actually independently took some of their reflections after the round table to launch their own thing, whether it's to write a paper, for example, or organize a panel discussion.
That's
And
such a good outcome.
like, it's really like this incubator of ideas and action
Yeah.
that you don't really see otherwise. And that's why it's so precious for me to maintain that. So yeah, very cheesy note for me to end, but I think that as you can see, I'm really passionate about it. So thank you for
Well,
having
I
me.
love ending on a cheesy, passionate note. Thank you so much for your time today, Yasmin. You've been really fantastic to talk to. You've given such good detail about RAISE. For all of our listeners, I will put links in the description to the document that you were talking about earlier, the report, and then I will also put links to information on RAISE. And I believe your contact details are there if people would like to get in touch with you about RAISE. Is that correct?
Yeah, totally.
It's wonderful. I will make sure to leave links to everything in the description. And if you'd like to reach out to Yasmin, you are more than welcome to. But thank you again, Yasmin. Again, you have been really fantastic to talk to, and it's just been so wonderful to have you on the podcast today.
No, thank you, Zena, for having me. I know it's fake for you. Thank you for having me.